Hello, my name's Sheehan. I'd like to talk to you today about Brahms' first symphony in C minor. And famously, this symphony took a long time for Brahms to complete. He put his initial drafts down as early as 1855, but it wasn't until 1876 that the piece was finished and premiered. So why the long wait? Why that 21 years of gestation? Well, Brahms was famously self-critical, and this first symphony was going to be a very public statement of his own creative genius, and he wanted it to be the best of who he was. He also wanted to have something of his own voice out of the shadow of Beethoven. Beethoven's genius loomed large in the mid to late 19th century, and Brahms very much wanted to be his own person with this first symphony. Now, having said that, you can hear elements of Beethoven in this work. For a start, the key of the symphony, C minor, of course, recalls Beethoven's Fifth, which is also in C minor. And in Brahms' first symphony, in the first movement, we have this repeated rhythmic idea, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, which might recall this. Another point of comparison is the finale of this symphony, the famous melody which makes up the first subject. Has always brought to mind the finale to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy. Brahms famously said any ass can see the similarities. Well, I always think that's a bit overstated. It's never really, whenever I've heard this symphony, I've always just enjoyed it as a wonderful melody by Brahms. But perhaps that's listening beyond Beethoven's shadow, as it were. So how does this symphony begin? Well, for the only time in Brahms' four symphonies, we have an introduction, and it's full of tragic intent. It goes like this. So what's going on in there? Well, for a start, we have this pedal note, C, in the bass. And when you listen to the symphony, you have the timpani belting out each quaver as well. It's like the timpanist is beating out a funeral march. On top of that repeated pedal note, we have two opposing forces. A rising idea counteracted by a descending idea. So we have this. Rising, descending, rising again, descending, rising. So there's this pulling away, there's this tension, this musical tug of war in the texture above that pedal note, which I think adds to the drama, the sense of tragedy and suffering in this music. And then we have these rather strange intervals Um, they're incredibly important in this movement. Those intervals occur in the first subject and the second subject. So listen out for that. After this, we have this expressive oboe solo. And again, that can perhaps be another comparison point with Beethoven's Fifth. If you recall, in that symphony, in the first movement, in the recapitulation, there's this famous moment of stasis where an oboe plays. Perhaps that recalls that in the introduction in this symphony. Then we have the first subject. We reach the exposition. A very stormy idea like this. Did you hear those intervals? That's from in the introduction, which we just heard. Then we have the transition, which is heralded by this staccato idea. Da 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 da, which eventually modulates into the relative major, E flat major. We hear a major version of the first subject in that transition as well. And eventually, as we think it's going to settle down into the relative major, the oboe begins the second subject proper with this rather tortuous idea, which again recalls those intervals in the introduction. And then that eventually, I think it's the clarinets and the horns, we have this idea. Very much in E flat. And then we're into this Codetta, back to stormier territory. Quite a thrilling moment in the symphony. And that rounds off the exposition. Quite often the exposition's repeated, although I quite like it when conductors go straight into the development, if I'm being honest, but that's a personal preference. The development is extremely exciting and dense with musical incident, but by and large it's based on that driving Beethoven rhythm, da 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 da. Much of the Codetta is developed. We have these long breathed ideas. Juxtaposed with that Beethoven rhythm. Eventually we get to the recapitulation. This time the first subject's shortened, and then we have the Codetta, it's extended, and finally we have this Coda, which perhaps recalls something of the funereal nature of the introduction. We have the timpanis again and the pedal note C. It's a rather wonderful movement, this first movement. The second movement is completely different in character. The first movement in C minor, and now we're in E major. I love that change, C minor, E major. And it's essentially a ternary form movement. The section A, there's two ideas in the A section. First one goes like this. this additional idea, which I think is a rather hopeful character to it. But my favourite moment in this movement is the transition from A to B. It's a lovely moment in this symphony. We have this classical, almost Mozartian idea, dun, 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 and above that we have this fragile line in the first violins. Really wonderful, just gets me every time. Eventually we get to the B section, which on the oboes I think we're in C sharp minor now, if we have this idea. Before we settle down into A flat. And Brahms develops that idea throughout the B section. We have this wonderful climax in the middle of this movement, which really just strikes at the heart. We have a transition and we're back to A again, greatly extended this time, with a glorious solo violin part. And we have the briefest of codas based on that transition idea again. Dun, dun, dun. The third movement's one of those skirts, this kind of mid-paced scherzo stroke minuet movements Brahms specialised in. They're never frenetic, perhaps with the exception of the Fourth Symphony. They're rather genial in nature. And the kind of minuet and trio form, although this one is slightly different, it begins with this rather charming idea. And this bit. So we have this really lovely kind of bucolic character to that music. Somewhat unusually for a scherzo, Brahms goes into a minor key. We have this rather Zigeuner feel to the music all of a sudden. Perhaps it brings to mind the Hungarian dances. Something like this. It's very brief, but I think it's significant enough to be its own section. Not the trio, but its own section. So I call that B. Then we have a brief return to A, and we come into the trio proper, which I call C. And it goes like this. That's stated, and then we have a return to A, this time without the kind of gypsy episode. And we have the briefest of codas, blink and you miss it, based on the trio. The fourth movement is absolutely wonderful. I think Brahms really has pulled just one of the greatest finales out of the bag here. It's just incredible. And it begins in the depths. Like the opening to the first movement, we're back in the realms of darkness, of tragedy, of despair. There's something of the human cry in this music from the heart, I think. It goes like this. This feeling of groping around in the darkness. Eventually we come to this moment of hope. A parting of the clouds, a ray of sunshine. And it's almost from the top of a mountain we hear this wonderful horn call, like this. This sense of space. It really is glorious, absolutely glorious. And with that horn call, we have this chorale intoned by the trombones, I think it is. It's like this. That will return with great power right at the very end of the movement. Then we have this famous melody, the first subject. Really beautiful melody, really inspired. We have a transition based on that, fortissimo. We have the second subject, rather charming, goes like this. And the second subject really is a group of ideas. We have this idea as well, more triumphant. And then we have this triplet idea. Listen out for the horns blazing away here. And then we have a return to the first subject, quite unusually. And then we have the development section after the return to the first subject. So Brahms is playing around with sonata form here. And the development is glorious, like the development of the first movement. It's very much based on the first subject, but also ideas from the introduction. Remember that? Dum dum dum, boom 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 boom. That comes back a lot. And the development ends in those glorious horn calls again, which we heard in the introduction, those moments of light. And that brings us to the recapitulation. Brahms has already recapitulated the first subject, if you like, before the development. So he carries on with the second subject. We have then a Codetta, we have then a Coda. And the Coda is a joyous celebration. And we have the return of those chorale chords. And the symphony ends in a glorious blaze of C major. Again, like Beethoven's Fifth and Beethoven's Ninth, a journey from darkness to light, but very much on Brahms's own terms and very much expressing his unique symphonic genius. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please subscribe and like this. If there's any suggestions for any other works you'd like me to analyse, please put them in the comments below. Thank you very much.